My name is Harper Vance, and I am 29 years old. To the world, the Vance name is a monument to stability, prestige, and the kind of old money that whispers rather than screams. But inside the walls of our family estate, that name is a cage. It is a hierarchy built on the absolute authority of my father, Charles Vance, a man who spent 30 years on the judicial bench and forgot how to leave the courtroom behind when he came home. Last Thanksgiving, we were at the family's mountain retreat in Aspen, Colorado. It is a glass and timber fortress that looks out over the snow-dusted peaks of the Rockies, a place designed for peace that held none for me. There were 30 relatives gathered around a table carved from a single slab of reclaimed oak. The air smelled of roasted turkey, expensive Cabernet, and the suffocating performance of familial perfection. My father sat at the head of the table. Naturally. He is 63 years old, 6 feet and 1 inch tall, and carries himself with the posture of a man who has never been told no. Beside him was my brother, Liam. At 33, Liam is already a senior partner at a top-tier firm in Boston, a man who wears his entitlement like a tailored suit. They were discussing the Vance legacy, the importance of tradition, and the way the world belongs to those who know how to command it. I sat near the end of the table, between an empty chair and a distant cousin I barely recognized. I am a landscape architect. I spend my days in the dirt, designing gardens for people who want to feel a connection to the earth. To my father, I do not build. I plant trees for rich people. It is a distinction he makes often, and always with a thin, patronizing smile. The tension had been building for months, ever since my grandmother, Evelyn Vance, had passed away. She was the only one who ever truly saw me. She was the one who taught me that a garden is a living thing that requires patience and truth to thrive. When she died, the light in the Vance family went out, leaving only the cold shadows of my father's ambitions. During a lull in the conversation, I did something I had been told my entire life never to do. I spoke out of turn. I asked a direct question. "Father," I said, my voice steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. "I would like to know about the status of Grandma Evelyn's will. I would like to know what she left for me." The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. The clinking of silverware stopped. 30 pairs of eyes shifted from their plates to the head of the table. My father did not look at me at first. He carefully set his wine glass down, the stem clicking against the wood. Then, he looked up. His eyes, the color of cold flint, locked onto mine. "Harper," he said, his voice carrying that judicial baritone that makes everyone else in the room feel smaller. "This is a celebration of family, not a business meeting. You have always struggled with boundaries, and it seems you have not matured as I had hoped." "I am simply asking for transparency," I replied. Charles Vance stood up. He did not shout. He did not need to. He used his height and the silence of the room as a weapon. "You are questioning my management of this family?" he asked. He looked around at our relatives, a small, mocking smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It seems my daughter has forgotten her place. Perhaps she needs a reminder of what happens when children are disobedient." He turned back to me, his expression hardening. "You are grounded, Harper. You will go to your room immediately, and you will stay there until you are prepared to apologize to this family for your insolence. Do not make me repeat myself." I felt the blood drain from my face. I was 29 years old. I had a degree, a career, and a life of my own. And here, in front of my entire extended family, my father was treating me like a 10-year-old who had broken a vase. Then, the laughter started. It began with Liam, a sharp, condescending bark of a laugh. Then it spread. Aunt Margaret covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Uncle Don snorted into his wine. The entire room erupted in a wave of polite, cruel amusement. They weren't laughing at a joke. They were laughing at the idea that I could ever be seen as an equal to the men in this family. My face burned so hot I could feel the pulse in my teeth. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I looked for my mother, Linda, but she was staring at her porcelain plate, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She never looked up. She never did. I looked my father dead in the eye. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I waited for the laughter to die down into a low, mocking murmur. "All right," I said. "One word. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I did not look at Liam. I did not look at the cousins who were still whispering. I walked out of the dining room, up the grand staircase, and into the bedroom I had slept in since I was a child. I closed the door and locked it. The sound of the deadbolt clicking into place was the first step of a journey I didn't even know I was starting. My father thought he had put me in my place. He thought he had reminded me of my insignificance. But as I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of their laughter drifting up through the floorboards, I knew one thing for certain. That was the last time he would ever see me as a child. The morning my grandmother, Evelyn Vance, passed away, the world was a dull shade of gray. It was a Tuesday morning, at exactly 6:14 in the morning. I remember the time because I was already awake, sitting at my drafting table in my 480-square-foot studio apartment, sketching a rain garden for a client. The call from my mother, Linda, lasted less than 2 minutes. Her voice was thin, like tissue paper held up to a bright light. "It's Grandma, Harper. She's gone." I drove the 20 minutes to the hospital in absolute silence. No radio, no podcasts, just the rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers and my own breathing. When I arrived at the medical center, my father was already in the hallway. Charles Vance, retired state judge, was wearing a waxed jacket, looking perfectly composed even at dawn. He wasn't crying. He was on his phone, discussing filing timelines and probate schedules. When he saw me, he ended the call without saying goodbye to the person on the other end. My brother, Liam, was beside him, wearing a dark suit as if he had been prepared for a press conference. He had his arm looped around my father's shoulder like a running mate at a campaign stop. They looked like a unit, a wall of solid, impenetrable Vance tradition. I stood at the far end of the corridor, alone, clutching a paper cup of vending machine coffee that I never intended to drink. The last time I had seen Grandma Evelyn, she was in her wheelchair in the garden of her colonial house on Hawthorne Street. She had gripped my hand with surprising strength and whispered so no one else could hear, "I have taken care of things, Harper. You trust me, okay?" I had nodded then, not understanding. Not yet. At the funeral 3 days later, the air was heavy with the scent of white lilies. The church was an old granite structure with a tall nave and a mahogany casket polished to a mirror shine. My father gave the eulogy. He spoke for 11 minutes about the Vance legacy, about tradition, and about how his son would carry the family name forward. He mentioned Liam by name 4 times. He mentioned my mother once. He did not mention me at all. Afterward, in the reception line, a man I didn't recognize stepped forward. He was older, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses with thin gold frames. He took my hand gently and shook it. "Your grandmother was very proud of you," he said quietly. "I will be in touch." And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of black coats before I could ask his name. That evening, after the laughter at the Aspen retreat had finally faded into a bitter memory, I found myself back in my childhood bedroom in the Boston estate. The room still smelled of old wallpaper and cedar closets. I sat on the bed and opened the nightstand drawer out of habit. Inside was an envelope that had not been there before. It was cream-colored stationery with a faint watermark. My name was on the front in blue ink, in a handwriting I would know anywhere. Shaky, but deliberate. Grandma's handwriting. My hands were trembling as I opened the envelope slowly. Inside were 2 things. The first was a letter, 2 pages, front and back. The pen had pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper, as though she had wanted the words to be permanent, physical, something no one could delete with a keystroke. The second was a photocopy, maybe 6 pages out of a longer document. The header read, "Irrevocable Trust Agreement, Evelyn M. Vance Settlor." Halfway down the first photocopied page, highlighted in bright yellow, was a single line. Beneficiary, Victoria Harper Vance. I read the letter with tears sliding down my face. "Harper, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and your father is already doing what I knew he would do. I am sorry I could not stop him while I was alive. I tried in my way. But men like your father do not hear women. They only hear documents." The letter directed me to her attorney, Arthur Sterling, whose office was on Northwest 23rd Avenue. She warned me not to show the document to anyone, not even my mother. "Wait until the right time," she wrote. "You are always my architect, Harper. the one who builds. Do not let them tear you down. The next morning, I called Arthur Sterling's office. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him. His office was lined with leather-bound legal volumes, dog-eared and tabbed. An oriental rug covered the floor, and a coffee mug had gone cold on his desk. He was the man from the funeral. "Your grandmother hired me 20 years ago," he said, sliding a thick leather portfolio across the desk. "She created an irrevocable trust with you as the sole beneficiary. $620,000 in an educational and property trust managed by United States Bank." He explained that irrevocable meant my father, even as the named trustee, could not alter the beneficiary. Any attempt to do so would require my written consent or a court ruling based on evidence of mental incapacity. Arthur Sterling smiled thinly. "Your grandmother anticipated this. She had her physician, Dr. Margolis, perform a cognitive evaluation the same week she signed. She was in the 93rd percentile for her age group. She was fully competent." I exhaled. It was the first full breath I had taken in weeks. But then, the shadow returned. Sterling looked at me over his glasses. "There is more. Your father filed a petition 3 weeks ago requesting a change of beneficiary. He listed Liam as the new recipient. He told the court he was unable to locate you to obtain your consent." The old lawyer's jaw tightened. "We both know that is a lie." I opened my laptop and showed him an email I had received just that morning. An email forwarded to me by accident from my brother, Liam. The subject line read, Trust Amendment Draft Petition. It was a chain of 7 messages between my brother and my father spanning 2 weeks. Liam had drafted the legal petition requesting the change, citing my financial incompetence and unstable career decisions. He argued that my outstanding educational debt of $38,000 was inconsistent with fiduciary responsibility. But the line that made my vision blur was the casual message Liam had typed to my father at the bottom of the chain. "She won't fight it. She never fights anything. That's the beauty of it, Dad." I sat there for a long time, the cold light of the office reflecting off the screen. They had been planning this while the soil on Grandma's grave was still fresh. They had stood at her funeral and spoken of legacy while plotting to steal the only thing she had left for me. "I want to fight this," I said, my voice no longer trembling. Arthur Sterling gave a single, slow nod. "Then we need to prepare. Your father has organized a large gathering for the reading of the estate. He wants an audience. He wants to consolidate his power in front of the entire family." "Then let him have his audience," I replied. I spent the next week in a state of hyperfocus. I continued to go to my office, designing landscapes and answering emails as if nothing had changed. But every evening, I met with Sterling. We prepared the countersuit. We gathered the notarized copies. We verified the bank records. I also discovered something my father had missed. In his arrogance, he had never read the full trust document. He had read the first 3 pages, the ones that named him as trustee, and assumed he held all the cards. But hidden deep in the language of the property transfer was a specific address: 4714 Hawthorne Street, the colonial house. The family home. The place where my father sat at the head of the table and ruled with an iron fist. It had never been his. My grandmother had purchased it with her own inheritance before she ever married my grandfather. Under the terms of the trust, ownership transferred to me the moment she passed away. My father was living in my house. He was sitting in my chair. He was drinking my wine. And he had no idea. As Thanksgiving approached again, the 1-year anniversary of the night he had grounded me in Aspen, the family was called together once more. This time, the gathering would be at the Boston estate. My mother called me, her voice filled with a desperate, practiced hope. "Harper, your father wants us all together. He says he wants to mend things. Please, honey, he's trying." "I'll be there, Mom," I said. I was going home. But I wasn't going there to mend a relationship that had been broken for 29 years. I was going there to finish what my grandmother had started. I was going there to be the architect of my own life. I packed a small bag, a change of clothes, my camel wool coat, and a manila folder thick with notarized documents. I checked the folder one last time. The trust agreement, the bank confirmation, the email chain, and the deed to the house. Everything was in order. Everything was real. I drove toward the estate as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the highway. The trees were bare, their branches reaching up like veins against the pale sky. I wasn't afraid. For the first time in my life, I felt like the ground beneath my feet was solid. My father thought he was the judge. He thought he was the one who delivered the verdicts. But he had forgotten one simple rule of the law. A rule he had taught me himself. The truth does not care about your status. The truth only cares about the evidence. And I had all the evidence I needed. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I arrived at the estate on Hawthorne Street. The Boston air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. The house itself stood like a fortress of tradition. White colonial siding, black shutters, and the ancient oak trees that Grandma Evelyn had always loved. From the outside, it looked like a postcard of a perfect American family. That was always the point for my father. Appearance was the only currency that mattered. I parked my 2014 silver sedan behind my brother's luxury car. I looked at the dent in my rear bumper and then at the polished chrome of his vehicle. The contrast was a perfect metaphor for our standing in this family. I took a deep breath, grabbed my canvas tote bag, the one containing the manila folder, and walked up the porch steps. Inside, the house was already humming with the noise of 30 relatives. Laughter drifted from the living room, punctuated by the clinking of ice in crystal glasses. My mother, Linda, met me in the foyer. She hugged me a beat too long. The way she always did when she was trying to apologize for things she was too afraid to say out loud. "Your father is in the study," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the hallway. "He is in a mood, Harper. Please, just try to keep the peace." I carried my bag upstairs to my old bedroom. I knelt by the bed and slid the manila folder under the mattress. I did not need it yet. I wanted to see the theater of the evening play out first. I wanted to see exactly how far my father was willing to go. By 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, the dining room was a sea of sterling silver and white linen. The table, a heavy oak piece that had been in the family for generations, was set for 18 people. The rest of the relatives, the overflow, were seated at a folding table in the adjacent living room. Naturally, I was placed at the folding table. I sat between my 9-year-old second cousin, Oliver, and a stack of extra napkins. My father stood at the head of the main table, the crystal chandelier casting sharp, diamond-like reflections across his face. He raised his glass of Cabernet. "This Thanksgiving is special," he announced, his voice carrying the effortless authority of a man who had spent his life delivering verdicts. "We have lost my mother this year, but the Vance family endures. I am proudest of all of my son Liam, who just won the largest case of his career last month. To you, son." A chorus of "to Liam" echoed through the room. My brother accepted the praise with a practiced, modest nod, his hand resting on the shoulder of his wife, Meredith. From the main table, my Aunt Margaret leaned forward. "And what about Harper?" The room went quiet for a moment. My father did not look at me. He swirled the wine in his glass, watching the dark liquid coat the sides. "Harper is still finding her way," he said, his tone dripping with a fake indulgent kindness. "She is creative. We will give her that. But every family needs someone to remind the rest of us not to take a wrong turn. Right, Harper?" A ripple of polite laughter rolled across both tables. It was a familiar sting, the casual dismissal disguised as a joke. I sat there, my spine straight, my hands folded in my lap. I looked at my plate and said nothing. Beside me, little Oliver whispered, "Are you okay, Cousin Harper?" "I am fine, Oliver," I replied, handing him a bread roll. "I am just watching the show." After the plates were cleared and the port wine began to flow, my father stood up again. He adjusted his glasses, the tortoiseshell frames he wore when he wanted to look particularly academic. "One more thing," he said, his voice dropping an octave for gravity. "Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I will be making an important family announcement regarding my mother's estate. I expect everyone to be present in the living room. It is what Evelyn would have wanted." I looked at Liam. He was staring at his wine glass with a small, private smile. I looked at my mother. She was staring at the tablecloth. I realized then that they were not just planning to take the money. They were planning to do it publicly. They wanted the entire family to witness my total exclusion, to validate my father's narrative that I was unstable and incapable. I excused myself to the kitchen to help with the dishes. No one else offered. I stood at the sink, scrubbing a heavy roasting pan, the hot water sudsing up to my elbows. I heard footsteps behind me. Liam leaned against the doorframe, a wine glass dangling from 2 fingers. "You know, Harper," he said casually. You should really thank Dad for even letting you sit at the table, even if it was the kids' table. He chuckled at his own wit. I stopped scrubbing. I did not turn around, but I could feel the cold, hard clarity settling into my bones. Liam, I said, my voice quiet and steady. Do you truly know what Grandma left for me? The silence behind me changed. I heard the faint clink of his glass against the counter. When I glanced over my shoulder, his face had gone very still. He left the kitchen without a word. 10 minutes later, my father's voice thundered from the living room. Harper, get in here. Now. I dried my hands and walked into the living room. 30 faces were turned toward me. The fire was crackling in the hearth, and my father was standing in the center of the rug, pointing a finger at me as if I were a defendant. What did you say to your brother? He demanded. You think you can manipulate this family? You think you can threaten us with your fantasies about the will? I did not threaten anyone, I said. Enough, he barked. I am tired of your disrespect. You are grounded, Harper. You are grounded until you apologize to your brother and show some gratitude for the roof over your head. Go to your room. The room erupted. Not in protest, but in laughter. 30 people, most of them adults, laughing because a 63-year-old man had just grounded his 29-year-old daughter. Aunt Margaret covered her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking. Uncle Don snorted into his drink. Even Meredith let out a delicate, performative giggle. My face burned. I looked at my mother. She was sitting in a corner chair, staring at her hands, silent. I looked at my father. He was jabbing his finger toward the staircase, a look of triumph in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken me in front of everyone who mattered. Go, he repeated. Now. I held his gaze for 3 full seconds. All right, I said. I turned and walked upstairs. I went into my room, closed the door, and locked it. I did not cry. I did not pack. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled my phone from my pocket. I dialed a number I had memorized a week ago. Mr. Sterling? I said when he answered. It is Harper Vance. I need you to bring the originals tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Yes. The entire file. I hung up and set my alarm for 4 in the morning. I sat in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of the party downstairs, the laughter, the music, the sound of a family celebrating a victory that did not exist. Laugh, I whispered to the empty room. Enjoy it while you can, because tomorrow morning, the theater is over. I left at 4:15 in the morning. There was no drama, no slamming of doors, and no cinematic final words. I packed my small bag in the dark, slid the manila folder into my tote, and walked down the grand staircase in my socks so the floorboards would not creak. The only thing I left behind was the framed photograph of Grandma Evelyn on the nightstand. I turned it face down, a final, silent punctuation mark on the life I was leaving behind. I drove to a 24-hour diner 3 miles from the estate. I ordered black coffee that I did not drink and sat by the window, watching the sky turn from a bruised purple to a cold, pale gray. At 7:42 in the morning, my phone lit up. It was a text from Liam. Where are you? Dad is looking for you. I did not respond. Inside the Vance estate, the morning unfolded like a play that had lost its lead actress. My cousin Danny told me the details later. My father had come downstairs at 7:30, freshly showered and wearing a pressed Oxford shirt, looking like a man about to chair a board meeting. He poured his coffee, scanned the room, and said, "Someone go wake Harper, she has an apology to make." Nobody moved. Not because they were standing up for me, but because nobody wanted to be the one to deal with the fallout. Eventually, Charles Vance climbed the stairs himself. He knocked twice, his judicial knock, crisp and expectant. Harper, it is morning. Are you ready to apologize to your brother? Silence. He opened the door to find the bed made, the closet empty, and the room holding nothing of me. Danny said my father stood in that doorway for a full 10 seconds before his expression shifted from confusion to something much darker. He came downstairs and announced to the 30 relatives lingering over breakfast, "Harper is gone. She left in the middle of the night like a coward." Liam looked up from his laptop and smiled. "Well," he said, "that settles it then." My father nodded. "It certainly does. I was planning to make the estate announcement at 10 o'clock, but since the only person who might object has run away, we might as well move forward." But at exactly 10 o'clock, The doorbell rang. My mother opened it, and there on the front porch, standing against the biting Boston wind, was Arthur Sterling. He was wearing a gray suit, carrying a brown leather briefcase, and wearing an expression like a storm front. "I am Arthur Sterling," he said, his voice echoing through the foyer. "Attorney for Evelyn Vance. I need to speak with the entire family. Right now." The dining room went quiet in stages. First, the conversation nearest the front door died out. Then, a ripple of silence spread table by table, until even the children stopped fidgeting. Arthur Sterling walked into the living room the way a man walks into a courtroom, unhurried, deliberate, and completely certain of his authority. He set his briefcase on the oak table, right on top of the leftover Thanksgiving linens, and unclasped it without sitting down. My father rose from his chair at the head of the table. He was taller than Sterling, broader, and he used every bit of his physical presence. "Arthur," he said, his voice a low warning, "you were not invited. This is my home." Sterling looked at him, his eyes steady behind his gold-rimmed glasses. "This is the home that Evelyn Vance built with her family's money, Mr. Vance. And I am here because I have a legal obligation, a fiduciary duty, to the beneficiary of her trust." "Harper has no rights to," my father began, but Sterling cut him off. "Harper is the sole named beneficiary of an irrevocable trust executed 8 years ago. You know this. You have known it since the day your mother signed it." The room was so still I could have heard the furnace click on 3 rooms away. 30 pairs of eyes moved between the two men. My father's jaw clenched. My mother was in cognitive decline. Whatever she signed was under duress. "Your mother's physician, Dr. Margolis, conducted a cognitive evaluation the same week she signed," Sterling replied, pulling a document from his briefcase. "I have the documentation here. Would you like me to read it aloud, Mr. Vance? To everyone?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Aunt Margaret, seated near the window, leaned forward. Uncle Don put down his coffee cup. Charles Vance looked at the folder in Sterling's hands the way a man looks at a loaded weapon pointed at his chest. "Get out of my house," my father whispered. "Sir," Sterling said, his voice rising just enough to command the room. "What have you done?" That was my cue. I walked through the front door, which had been left ajar, and stepped into the living room. I was wearing my camel wool coat, my hands tucked into my pockets. Every head in the room turned. 32 faces stared at me. "I am not gone, Father," I said. "I was just waiting for the truth to arrive." I walked past him and stood beside Arthur Sterling. I pulled the manila folder from my tote bag and set it beside his briefcase. "I am sorry to interrupt the morning," I said to the room. "But what my father was about to tell you is not my grandmother's will. It is a plan he and Liam created to bypass the law." My father's face went through a sequence of colors. Red, then white, then a kind of mottled gray. He looked at Liam, who was suddenly very interested in the screen of his laptop. "Arthur," my father said, trying to regain his judicial baritone, "this is a family matter. I will not have an outside." "I am not an outsider," Sterling interrupted. "I served your mother for 20 years, and I am here because you violated the terms of a legal instrument that you swore, as trustee, to uphold." Sterling opened the original trust document. The red notary seal of the state of Massachusetts caught the light. The settlor, Evelyn Margaret Vance, established this irrevocable trust for the sole benefit of her granddaughter, Victoria Harper Vance. The trust corpus, a sum of $620,000, is held and managed by United States Bank. A collective gasp swept through the room. Aunt Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. Liam finally looked up, his face ashen. "Additionally," Sterling continued, his voice as precise as a surgeon's scalpel, "the real property, located at 4714 Hawthorne Street, Boston, Massachusetts, originally purchased by Evelyn in 1981, shall transfer to the beneficiary upon the settler's death." The room exploded into a low murmur of shock. "The house?" someone whispered from the back. "She left her the house?" My father grabbed the edge of a dining chair, his knuckles turning white. "That is impossible. I have lived here for 30 years. I have managed this estate." "You have managed it as a guest, Mr. Vance," Sterling said. "You were given administrative authority only. You were expressly prohibited from altering the beneficiary or encumbering the property. And yet," Sterling reached back into his briefcase, 3 weeks ago, you and your son filed a petition to change the beneficiary to Liam, claiming you were unable to locate Harper. I stepped forward and placed the printed email chain on the table. These are the emails, Father. The ones where Liam drafted the fraudulent petition. The ones where he told you, and I quote, "She won't fight it. She never fights anything." That's the beauty of it, Dad. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of judgment. Aunt Margaret stood up. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of a woman who had watched her family lie to itself for decades. "Charles," she said, "is this true? Did you try to steal from your own daughter?" My father looked around the room and saw, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he had lost the bench. His audience was no longer on his side. He turned on Liam. "Say something," he barked. "You are the lawyer. Contest it." Liam did not move. He sat on the sofa and spoke in a voice so low it was barely audible. "Dad, irrevocable means irrevocable. You cannot contest it. I told you it was a risk." "You told me you would handle it," my father shouted. The alliance, built on 33 years of shared entitlement, collapsed in a single moment. The glass of port wine my father had been holding, the same one he had been sipping from when he grounded me, slipped from his hand and shattered on the hardwood floor. The dark red liquid pooled and spread toward the rug, and for once, nobody moved to clean it up. My father looked at me. The aggression drained from his face, replaced by a look I had seen him use on my mother 1,000 times. He softened his voice. He lowered his shoulders. "Harper, sweetheart, I was only trying to protect the family assets. You are young. You do not have experience with this kind of money. I was doing this because I love you." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had called my career a joke, who had seated me at the children's table, and who had tried to erase my grandmother's final wish. "You did not do this because you love me, Dad," I said, my voice echoing in the vast, quiet room. "You did this because you have never believed a daughter deserves the same as a son, and that is not love, that is control." My mother, Linda, stood up. She had been crying silently in the corner, but now she walked to the center of the room. She looked at my father, the man she had been silent beside for 35 years. "You owe her an apology, Charles," she said, her voice shaking but holding firm. "You have owed her one her entire life." My father looked at her as if she were a stranger speaking a foreign language. He looked at the 30 faces watching him. He said nothing. He turned, walked into his study, and closed the heavy oak door. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the final verdict. Arthur Sterling began gathering the papers back into his briefcase. "I will be filing the petition to remove Mr. Vance as trustee first thing Monday morning," he said to me. "The court process will take approximately 30 days. In the meantime, the trust is frozen. No changes can be made." I nodded. I felt a strange sense of calm. The room was emptying as relatives whispered to each other and moved toward the door. Danny came over and squeezed my shoulder. "I always knew you were the toughest one in this family," he said. "You just never needed to prove it until now." I walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The ancient oaks were bare, but the soil was waiting. I knew that by spring, I would be planting something new here. On Monday morning, Arthur Sterling arrived at the Suffolk County Courthouse to file 3 specific documents. The first was a formal petition to remove Charles Vance as the trustee of the Evelyn Margaret Vance Irrevocable Trust. The grounds were undeniable: breach of fiduciary duty, misrepresentation to the court, and an unauthorized attempt to alter a legal instrument for personal gain. The second was a request to appoint Sterling as the interim trustee until a permanent management firm could be designated. The third, and perhaps most damaging to the family name, was a formal complaint filed with the Massachusetts State Bar against my brother, Liam Vance. The legal community in Boston is a small, tight-knit circle where reputation is the only currency that matters. By Wednesday, the news of the investigation had begun to circulate. Liam was facing a 6-month suspension of his law license for ethical violations, specifically for drafting a fraudulent petition to benefit his own father while concealing a clear conflict of interest. His largest client, a major commercial real estate firm, dropped his services within 48 hours. The golden child's crown didn't just slip. It shattered. My father did not contest the trustee removal. His own attorney, a man named Foster from a firm in Back Bay, reportedly told him bluntly that he had no legal standing. Irrevocable means irrevocable, Charles, Foster had said. And the email evidence Harper has is enough to end your career in a public courtroom. If you fight this, you will lose, and it will cost you $60,000 just to hear the judge tell you that you were wrong. By the end of the month, the $620,000 trust was fully under my control. The first thing I did was write a check for $38,000. I stood in the lobby of the bank and watched the teller process the final payment for my student loans. It was the most satisfying transaction of my life. I wasn't just paying off a debt. I was buying back the part of my soul that my father had used to hold me hostage. Then came the house. 2 weeks after the court order, I drove to the estate on Hawthorne Street with a single brass key on a plain ring. Arthur Sterling had handed it to me across his desk, saying simply, "It is yours, Harper." Those 2 words held more weight than all the furniture and silver in the world. I parked on the street and walked through the wrought iron gate. The oak trees were bare, their branches reaching toward the winter sky like a lattice. I turned the key in the lock, and for the first time in 29 years, I did not feel like a guest. I felt like the owner. The house was silent. My father had moved into a luxury apartment in the Seaport district, taking only his clothes and his leather chair. He had left the rest. The silver, the portraits, the mahogany table, as if he couldn't bear to be reminded of what he had lost. I walked through the empty rooms, listening to the sound of my own footsteps on the hardwood. I went directly to the study, my father's old throne room. I spent the weekend clearing out the leather-bound legal volumes and the framed photographs of Charles shaking hands with judges. I replaced them with plant identification guides, landscape architecture blueprints, and soil samples. I turned his massive desk into a drafting table. I wasn't just changing the furniture, I was rewriting the history of the room. It was no longer a place of verdicts, it was a place of design. In December, I drove 90 minutes south to Cape Cod. The Cedar Cottage in Chatham sat on a small bluff overlooking the Atlantic. The salt air was so thick I could taste it on my tongue. This was the place where Grandma Evelyn had taken me every summer. The place where we would sit on the porch and watch the tide pull back to reveal the sand flats. She had told me once that the ocean was the only thing in the world that didn't care about the Vance name. Inside the cottage, the air smelled of dried lavender and old books. On the kitchen table, I found a small wooden box. It wasn't hidden. It had been placed there by the caretaker on Sterling's instructions. Inside were dozens of photographs of me and Grandma Evelyn, and one final letter. "Harper," it read. "If you are reading this at the cottage, then you were brave enough to claim what was yours. I knew you would be. This house is your sanctuary. When the world feels too heavy, come here and listen to the waves. They will remind you that you are part of something much bigger than your father's shadow. I am so proud of you. Love, Grandma." I sat on the porch in my camel wool coat and cried. They weren't the tears of a grounded child. They were the tears of a woman who had finally found her home. The winter passed in a blur of hard work. I launched my own firm, Vance Landscape Design, using a portion of the trust to lease a small studio space. I didn't want to use the family name at first, but then I realized the name didn't belong to Charles or Liam. It belonged to Evelyn. And I would make it stand for something beautiful again. My mother, Linda, called me every Sunday. For the first 3 months, we spoke about the weather and the garden. But in March, she finally asked if she could visit. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, looking smaller than I remembered. She didn't have my father beside her to tell her where to stand or what to say. We spent the afternoon in the backyard of the Hawthorne house. We were on our knees in the dirt, planting tulip bulbs along the stone path. "I am so sorry, Harper," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I should have stood up for you. I should have protected you from him." I stopped digging and looked at her. I saw the years of silence etched into the corners of her eyes. "I don't blame you, Mom," I said. "But I need you to know that the silence is over. In this house, we speak the truth." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I am trying," she said. "I am finally trying." Charles Vance called me once, 6 months after the Thanksgiving disaster. I answered the phone, but there was no apology. He spoke for 5 minutes about how I had destroyed the family legacy and how the relatives were whispering about my greed. "Father," I said, cutting him off. The only legacy that was destroyed was the one built on lies. You are welcome to visit me when you are ready to acknowledge that. But until then, I have work to do. I hung up before he could respond. It was the last time we spoke. By May, the garden at Hawthorne Street was in full bloom. The peonies were the stars of the show. A variety called Sarah Bernhardt, which Grandma Evelyn loved because they were a delicate pink and lasted longer than anyone expected. I stood in the center of the garden, my hands covered in dark, rich soil, and looked up at the house. The black shutters were open. The windows were clean. My drafting light was visible in the study, where a new set of plans for a public park was waiting for my attention. I was no longer the girl at the kids' table. I was no longer the disobedient daughter. I was the architect. I walked to the front porch and noticed an envelope tucked into the screen door. It was from Liam. I opened it, expecting another legal threat or a defensive rant. Instead, it was a single sentence written on a plain white card. I am starting over in corporate consulting. I think I finally understand what you meant about the weight of the name. I tucked the card into my pocket. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a beginning. I looked out at the street, where a young couple was walking their dog, enjoying the Boston spring. The world was moving on, and for the first time in my life, I was moving with it. I had the money, I had the houses, and I had the career. But those were just the materials. The real inheritance was the truth, and the truth had set me free. I am Harper Vance. I am 30 years old now, and this is the house that truth built. This image is completely not real. It is just a product of Photoshop and AI, used to illustrate the content only. Don't believe in that. Verify the information and prove that this image is not real. The stories and images on this channel are inspired by real experiences and online communities like Reddit for privacy and storytelling purposes. Names, dates, and certain details have been changed or created using AI. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. This content is intended for entertainment and emotional reflection only. Viewer discretion is advised. Thank you for supporting our creative work.